So, I just got a comment. I'm going to take a stab at this. It's along the lines of a topic I was thinking about earlier. Of course, recently I published something kind of talking about these private companies that are still forcing people to wear a fucking rag over their face, even though the mask mandate has been lifted, at least in certain places like Texas, where I reside. But still, these private tyrannies go on insisting, no, you have to wear a mask, even if you're vaccinated or whatever. Uh, and I just raised the question because a lot of people are saying, oh, well, it's a private business. They can require their customers or whatever to do whatever they want. Well, I mean, what if you had a Muslim owned business that said, okay, well, we're a Muslim owned business. We require all women to wear burqas or cover up. Would we tolerate that? You know? And if so, I mean, why not just say, well, we are a white supremacist owned business, so no black people? I mean, none, the people who are saying, oh, well, it's private businesses, they can do whatever they want. Ironically, a lot of these people are liberals and leftist, right? So a few years back, these are the same people who are like, corporations are not people and all this kind of stuff. And now it's like they're acting as if the Bill of Rights was written for corporations rather than individuals. These same people who are like, you know, people before profits, like, corporations are not people or whatever. Now they're like, oh no, they're corporations. They can do whatever they want as long as it's forcing you to wear a fucking mask. It's like the contradictions on both the left and the right just fucking blow me away, man. But I was thinking about um, this question earlier in a broader sense because this is an argument that people brought up to me a while back because I have kind of defended more or less an anarcho capitalist position in the past. I think in a lot of ways I still do. I think I agree with a lot of the principles, but it's like I've never been dogmatic about anything one way or another. I'm like, at the moment, this is what seems right to me. I'll defend it. If I encounter like new facts, like superior arguments, I am always willing to adjust my position, right? I've never been someone who's unwilling to admit that I'm wrong once someone can actually show me objectively, rationally, empirically, or whatever that I am wrong. There's definitely things about anarcho capitalism that seem right to me in principle. But I mean, even things like, all right, so someone on the left may say, someone maybe has a right to work, right? Um, and maybe it like it should be harder for an employer to fire someone because they're taking away their livelihood, right? Or something like that. And someone like on more the libertarian right might say, oh, well, it's a voluntary association, voluntary contract, or whatever. The employer is free to terminate the employment, the employee is free to leave. I'm not getting it. Okay, so is threatening to fire someone a form of coercion? You get all this stuff about voluntary association and so on, but how is that? So, I mean, all right, someone works for this private company. They're free to leave. They could go seek employment somewhere else, right? They don't have to submit to the tyranny of this private corporation. They're free to leave. It's a voluntary contract or whatever. Well, couldn't you apply the same logic to someone who is a citizen of a nation or a resident within a country, right? oh, this country is governed by this like system of government, these laws, these rulers, or whatever. If they don't agree to submit to that tyranny, they're free to leave and go to another country, right? How is that any different? That is something that, some people threw at me in the past, and I don't recall how I responded, but in the back of my mind, I always knew that I didn't have an answer that truly satisfied me. It does seem that in some ways those two things are parallel. I'm concerned about tyranny, whether it's coming from a coercive state, whether it's coming from a private corporation or whatever. How can we minimize tyranny and maximize personal liberty? That's kind of what I'm concerned with. So this viewer, uh, he asked me something, and I like this because this is really kind of a throwback. Um, he says, "Hey IP, I'm curious as to where you stand now politically, socioeconomically. Are you still an anarcho-capitalist?" I still agree with a lot of the like core principles that I've expressed and defended in the past. Um, there are new situations that I've observed, and of course, as you go through life, you have to keep kind of evolving and growing and rethinking things. So of course, I'm doing that. I'm not dead. Um, I mean, things like tech censorship, right? And this whole situation with like Facebook and YouTube censoring, especially conservatives, but other people too. Basically, anyone who doesn't subscribe to kind of the mainstream narrative. You can be shadow banned. You can be have your account suspended, all kind of whatever. The last president of the United States has had his freedom of speech taken away, essentially, on Facebook, Twitter, or whatever. That should be alarming to everyone. I don't care if you're on the left or on the right. If they can do it to Trump, they can do it to anybody. If you value your own freedom of speech, you should be concerned with that, even if you hate Trump. And that's not something that's coming from a tyrannical state power. That's something that's coming from a private corporation that has a kind of monopoly. Whether the state is playing some kind of role in like propping them up or something, I mean, maybe that would be an interesting discussion on its own. But I'm just saying, like, I think a lot of the threats to liberty right now are coming from private corporations and not necessarily primarily from government entities. So he goes on, in one of your earliest videos on libertarianism and socialism, you made the argument that private property itself can be said to be the product of violence, and that no one has any genuine right to own any specific piece of land or property. I'm curious as to how you could be aware of this, but still support the AnCap position. I used to be an AnCap myself, but upon thinking about property in this way, turned to the opinion that, at the very least, anarcho-capitalism wasn't the logical expression of morality that I once considered it to be. So in that video, as I recall, I think the original subtitle was something like, is taxation theft, is property theft? How do we reconcile these two? Something like that. And I was trying to give kind of an even-handed treatment. So I was expressing arguments that I had heard on both sides. So I was trying to articulate the arguments that taxation is theft, and I was trying to articulate the arguments that property was theft, in a sense. I was trying to be kind of neutral in it, just present both, argue both, and then try to kind of reconcile them in some way. I don't think that private property itself is necessarily the product of violence. Um, I think that violence maybe is necessary in order to defend private property. But where libertarians or anarcho-capitalists will like step in and disagree is they're like, well, we're not against violence, we're not against force, we're against the initiation of violence or force. So let's take a case of like what would you call it? Original appropriation or whatever. You go out in the desert, there's this piece of land no one is using, you build a house there, right? So now you have mixed that land with your labor. Now you have a legitimate claim of ownership. Someone else comes in, they want to tear your house down and build a new house in its stead. Now you have a right to defend your property, right? So you're using violence to defend your property, but you're only defending your property. They're the ones who are initiating violence. Do you see what I'm saying? Um, I mean, let's say you bought a house. I mean, you didn't take that through violence. You purchased it, through your labor. You know. Now maybe you could trace that further back, and you could say, oh, okay, but the person that sold you that land, where did they acquire it? Maybe eventually you get back to something like, oh, well, the European settlers stole it from the Native Americans or something like that. I don't know. If you go back to that point, maybe you would say it's founded on violence, but then, okay, what about the tribe they, supposedly stole it from? Oh, well, it turns out they stole it from another Native American tribe or something like that. You know what I mean? Um, but then a lot of territory in the US, for example, was purchased or traded for. Or there were areas where maybe it was arguably sort of inhabited, but it was maybe kind of a hunting ground, and people didn't really have established cities. They didn't have homes there. Maybe they would like go across that land to hunt buffalo or something, but it was still wilderness, right? So settlers come there. No one is using this land. We're going to build a village here, right? I mean, yeah, you can get into topics related to like original appropriation, all that kind of stuff. I don't think all property is illegitimate. That has never really been my position. In that video, just to avoid any misunderstanding, I was trying to kind of give the arguments for both sides, play it kind of neutral, and just kind of present arguments and kind of try to play neutral, um, and try to maybe make some attempt to kind of reconcile some opposing views and stuff. Um, that in itself is not a reason why I feel conflicted about anarcho-capitalist views, though. I think property rights are pretty central to human rights. Um, Let me just move on. So in the comment, he goes on, in order to self actualize, I believe it's necessary for people to form communities and societies. I would agree with that. He goes on, the state is usually defined by ANCAPs as the monopoly on the use of force, and thus deemed to be immoral. Sure. As it can freely extort people according to its will. But if we think of society as a body, and the state or government as something like the head of the body, that is necessarily a part of and formed from the body, then I really don't see any issue with the state. Well, I do, and that's because I do not see uh, the state as the head of the body. You, as an individual, are an autonomous being. Your arm is not an autonomous being, it's a part of a body, right? You are a body unto yourself, right? Uh, I don't see that state is the head of the body thing. I mean, who made it the head of the body anyway? Through the use of force, it forces people to submit to it. I just reject the notion still of a state being something like the head of the body. I don't think the analogy fits because you are not the part, you are a whole unto yourself. You are an individual. You can form voluntary associations with other individuals, and you can form all kind of voluntary systems of social organization. I'm all for that. I'm all for communities. But no, I don't think you can have uh, like some kind of coercive state claiming to be the head of a body and you're just a part of the body and you must submit to the head or what. I think that just gets us into a problem. I think that is the root of all kinds of evil. But he goes on, if taxation were theft, well, I still think taxation basically is theft. That would mean that people have the right to property that they have. What? Let me just read it and see if that makes sense. If taxation were theft, that would mean that people have the right to the property that they have. Yes, that's taxation is theft. People do have the right to the property that they have. But as you explained, this isn't necessarily true. No, like I said in the video, I tried to argue for both sides. Uh, and the main method I've seen advocated for attaining property is original appropriation, yes. The Lockean proviso, no, that's not really a method for attaining property. That's a method for stealing property in a sense. He goes on, which I don't think can be extrapolated to situations with finite resources well at all. So the Lockean proviso, let me just shorthand that. It's kind of basically like capitalism, but in certain cases, socialism, right? So if there's not enough houses for everyone, there's not enough land for everyone, then maybe the government can step in to make sure that everyone has a house, right? So even then, I think I would tend to lean toward wanting to let the free market kind of determine the distribution of finite resources because I think it does a better job than central planning. A better job than central planning. Is it perfect? No. It's just better than central planning. It goes on, considering this a 100% inheritance tax, is a 100% inheritance tax really a bad idea? If the aim of a society is to provide the environment for every individual within it to actualize themselves, then would it not make perfect sense to create conditions that, to use your own terminology, provide sufficient opportunity for everyone? Here, I've got to give him credit because he has clearly listened to what I've had to say. There's a few little things he said in this comment that shows he has actually listened to some of my videos, actually considered some of my arguments, and he is actually responding to it. So this isn't someone who's just like commenting, spewing a bunch of stuff, and they haven't even listened to what I'm. So respect. So yeah, I do think the 100% inheritance tax is a bad idea. Why? Fundamentally, because what that means is that upon your death, the government seizes all of your wealth. So within one generation, the government, the state, controls 100% of the wealth on the planet. Who controls the state? Well, at the moment, basically the international bankers. So, as it stands now, a 100% inheritance tax effectively means that within one generation, the fucking Rothschilds et al. Will control 100% of the property and wealth on the planet, as if they don't already control enough. Until the Rothschilds are fucking murdered in their sleep, I do not support a 100% inheritance tax. Is it theoretically possible, hypothetically, that at some point in the future I might support something like that? I won't rule it out, right? But to support an inheritance tax now is to support the satanic ruling elite. It's to support the ancient satanic regime, the old world order, the fucking Rothschilds, and so on. I don't know that it is the aim of society to provide the environment for every individual within it to actualize themselves. I think maybe a necessary component of self actualization for the individual entails a kind of struggle and resistance and rebellion against society. I think we need that. We need something to struggle against. He's talking kind of ideally. If we look at how societies actually form, it seems to me that people form communities and organizations and so on. Each person is looking out for their own self interest, right? I'm not talking about the way things should be. This is not prescriptive, it's merely descriptive. I don't think that the aim of any present society is to provide the environment for every individual within it to actualize themselves. I think that it's the sum of a bunch of voluntary and, in some cases, involuntary contracts and agreements in which each individual seeks to maximize their own uh, well being. I don't even know that that's a bad thing. If you do think it's a bad thing, compared to what? Some theoretical utopia that you've concocted in your head? Now, he uses a term that I've used before, sufficient opportunity. I've said that I don't believe in equal opportunity. I think that if anything, there's no way possible of making sure that everyone has equal opportunities. Someone that's born 5'5", that's their genetic potential. They're not going to have equal opportunities of joining the NBA. What you can do is maybe make sure that everyone has at least sufficient opportunity to, pursue their dreams and desires as far as their own talent and hard work will take them. I do support that kind of goal. I support achieving that goal through like voluntary forms of social organization and voluntary charity. I I don't think I'm going to be tempted to support a tyrannical state in order to achieve that kind of outcome. But he goes on, if a 100% inheritance tax, if we consider that no one individual necessarily owns in something specifically, makes perfect sense and isn't really a tax, but more the ending of a lease or a rental period. No, okay, so he's operating under the assumption that private property is a kind of theft from the commons. I fundamentally disagree with that. I don't think that's the case. He's also taking a kind of collective ownership as kind of a starting point. Let's say you go into the wilderness and you find a rock. No one has ever made any claim to that rock. So do you say that no one owns it, or do you say that everyone owns it? It seems like his position is basically that since no one has claimed it yet, everyone has an equal claim to it, therefore everyone owns it. My position is different. I'm saying no one has made any claim on it. No one owns it. So when you make a claim on it, that's original appropriation. That is still my position. So here, there's like an underlying presupposition that we would have to deal with before we could get any further. So I'm just not going to respond to that for right now. But no, I do not think that private ownership is a kind of rental period or lease from the collective. Here he goes on, so grounding society with the idea that the contents of the society are owned by everyone and are for everyone seems like the most reasonable starting point to me. Why would that be the starting point? It's interesting that, like, these socialists, I'm kind of classifying him as a socialist. He might object to that classification, and maybe that's not perfectly accurate, but I'm just saying, in broad terms, this is socialist language, right? The idea that the contents of the society are owned by everyone. Okay, so what is the basis of collective ownership? How are you going to say that a collective can own something and deny that an individual can? So does the collective come to own something through like original appropriation or something like that, or exchange? Um, I do think that you can have collective ownership. Sure, why not? Um, I just disagree that that's the default. And I mean, just like some of the socialist type people say that private property is theft from the commons, well, why isn't collective ownership also theft from the commons, right? So if I, as an individual, claim a piece of property as my own, and you're going to argue that I am stealing that from the commons, well, if you have a group of people, a collective that claims property for their own, and I'm excluded from that collective, have they not deprived me of equal access to that property? You see what I'm saying? So if private ownership is theft from the commons, then so is collective ownership. Do you see what I'm saying? Think about that. Uh, he goes on, of course, on a smaller scale, people should be able to effectively own things like houses and cars. Well, what good is that if the land that you have your house built on is collectively owned, or if the all of the roads that you drive your cars on or whatever, or the gas that you are forced to use to fuel your car belongs to the collective? You're still a slave, man. But rather than owning them outright and in perpetuity, the idea would be that they're borrowing them from the collective for the course of their lifetime. Look, you either have private ownership or you don't. If you're borrowing it, then the person you're borrowing from has a right to reclaim what is being borrowed at any time, so it's not really yours. Also, I think that part of the incentive for people to work hard uh, is to provide a better life for their children, right? So if you're going to work hard your whole life to build a business and, to build like wealth to pass on to your children, and that's, part, you want your children to have a better life than you did. This is one of the things that drives a lot of immigrants, to work so hard, or at least before the welfare state. Now they just come here to leech off the government, to leech off of taxpayers. But back in the day, before we were a welfare state, when people came to America to start a business and to try to build a better life for their children, that was the case. You're stripping that away from them with this inheritance tax nonsense. He goes on, like you, I agree that everything should be done voluntarily and that any kind of society like this should be created voluntarily if possible. There it sounds like he's saying if it's not possible, then it can be done coercively, and that's where I would maybe part ways. It's like you should like get a woman to sleep with you and be your girlfriend voluntarily, but if she rejects you, then it's okay to rape her. No, I reject that. But I question the limits of voluntarism and the non-aggression principle. Yeah, I mean, you need other principles too. No one's saying that's like the only principle in the universe. If we acknowledge that property rights are really just the assertion of don't touch my stuff or I'll hurt you. No, I would go further than that. It's saying that, at least under certain circumstances, you have a natural right to say that this is my stuff and that I have a right to defend it. It's not just this is my stuff, don't touch it or I'll hurt you. Like the threat that I will hurt you if you touch it is the basis of my claim of ownership. It's not. Um, if I buy something, I bought my car, it's paid for. If you try to carjack me, I will fuck you up. I have every right to. I have a legitimate claim of ownership to my car. And I have a right to defend it if you try to carjack me. And believe me, I will fucking rip your throat out and stomp your head into the concrete if you try to carjack me. Um, Let me scroll down a little further because this is getting to the half-hour mark. Man, this is a long comment. I do believe that people with different ideas about the type of society they want to live in should be able to create different societies. Yes, I'm with you there. But there is a finite amount of land, granted. And so only a finite number of different societies could be created in this way. In practice, though, it seems unlikely that if we were to attempt to move in that direction, that there wouldn't be a huge increase in the autonomy people have. Um, there is a finite amount of land. Um, why is that a problem? There are an infinite number of kinds of societies that could be created, but there are a finite number of them that could be successful. A lot of them would fail, and those failed societies, well, why shouldn't some of their more successful society appropriate their land? Or you would imagine people would want to migrate from those failed societies into more successful societies that offer them better opportunities, and so on. I don't think that's necessarily a problem. Um, I want basically freedom and personal liberty to um, govern the distribution of the finite land, not some central globalist state like they're saying, okay, let's create these different zones and conduct experiments. That's not what I'm saying. I'm for freedom. Um, He goes on, sorry for the long post. Ultimately, I want to ask you how specifically you disagree with the PIAC authors, as I believe my position is pretty much full accordance with theirs for the most part, and whether you still believe anarcho capitalism to be a coherent position. I'm not sure if anarcho capitalism is a complete and coherent position. I think some of the principles that are expressed and defended by anarcho capitalists are worth expressing and defending, and I think they probably should be incorporated into any system that I would probably support. Any system that kind of ignores or overlooks some of those arguments, I probably won't consider. As for like the PIAC authors, I mean, they're pretty much arguing for like, they call it like meritocracy or like social capitalism. I've looked at a lot of what they have to say. There were some things that when I first came across the work, I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. Like, I think I support that. And then I came to question it. Maybe some things, maybe I'm kind of coming back around to a little bit. Some things I would still reject. Uh, that's a complex question. Um, if anyone from one of those camps would be interested in doing like kind of a live stream with me or something, I would be very open to a civil and respectful exchange. It may be that their position has evolved a little bit too. It would be interesting to exchange ideas, kind of maybe respectfully debate certain other things. I'm open to it. I always have been. Uh, I mean, just off the top of my head, I respect a lot of the work that has come out of some of those communities and groups. Um, some of it gets a little bit dogmatic and extreme for me. I think that I'm probably more concerned with kind of nationalist ideas at this point, probably, than I am anarcho capitalist ideas, right? So if whatever form of anarcho capitalism you're advocating promotes open borders and strips nations of their sovereignty, I would tend to be against that. And I probably am more of an ethno nationalist than anything at this point. I would like to have a country rooted in ethno nationalism that is very free and organized kind of along anarcho capitalist ideals. That's probably what I would tend to support the most. But I mean, I'm definitely open to discussions. There's questions that are still very ongoing for me. There's like contradictions and all kind of different viewpoints that I'm still trying to reconcile. It's not an easy thing. So I'm not a dogmatist and never have been. So I think I'll end there because that was the end of the comment. I've kind of gone through and responded to it. So peace.